Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a small three-game slate. All three of these games have pretty similar spreads, around 5 to 6 points, and then all of them have 145 to 155 point totals, with UNC being the faster paced and the Texas game being the slowest one, and the West Virginia Baylor game being right in the middle. I have 5 plays that I like quite decently today, and I have 4 plays that I think are secondary options. So I'll go ahead and get into those. I'm going to start with the most expensive to the least expensive on the top tier plays here. We're going to start with Baycott for UNC. He's obviously been really good this season, though he hasn't had a 40 fantasy point game since January 24th. That's 5 games ago, but he does have some solid upside here in this matchup, which is a plus matchup for him. And I don't really see Miami having too much issue or too much ability to stop him too much. He should be able to get a double-double here, which he does get most of the time. I do think he'll pay off on the slate, but he hasn't been all that consistent lately, getting over 40 fantasy points. Then we're going to look at Omir for Miami of Florida. I also think he has double-double potential today. He usually scores in double figures, and he does get some decent rebounds. He does play around 28 minutes a game. It is a tough matchup, though, against Baycott, which is a little bit worrying, but he is a little bit overpriced, but he's still viable on the slate, and he's a pretty decent option off of Baycott simply because he has just as much potential as Baycott does in this matchup when it comes to fantasy output. Then we're going to look at our 3 guards I like a lot, and we're going to start with Jordan Miller. He's my favorite, most expensive guard at $7,600. He feels pretty safe today. He's actually got a pretty decent price. He's been playing pretty well. He's been over 30 fantasy points in 6 of the last 8 games. It is a tougher matchup against North Carolina, but honestly, North Carolina hasn't been that great defensively, and it is the highest scoring game on the slate. And he does have a pretty good floor as well. I actually expected his price to be a little bit higher today, so I'm glad to see it at $7,600. So he's definitely somebody I think is a top-tier option for your lineup. Then we're going to look at Joe Toussaint for West Virginia. Now, he's my favorite value play on the slate. He looks like a pretty good option. He's not a must-play because his minutes tend to fluctuate a little bit, and he can get under 10 fantasy points sometimes, but he is actually not. He is pretty rare at that. He hasn't had many under 10 fantasy point games this season, and so he has a pretty safe floor, all things considered, and he also has some pretty good upside. He's had some games in the mid-30s, but a lot of games in the 20s throughout the season, and obviously if he can get 20 fantasy points in this game, that will pay off for us greatly. So he's my top value play on the slate. And then I have one more guy, and that's going to be Langston Love. Now, he is a value play. He's not as consistent as Toussaint is, and his floor is really low, but he does get about 20 minutes a game on average, and he has some upside here. Obviously, it's not as high of an upside as Toussaint does, but as far as a good value play, he's a decent one, and he projects pretty well today. And if you want to pay up for other guys, you're going to have to pay down for a couple dudes, and he would be probably one of the better sub $5,000 players to choose from. Then we're going to get into the 4 plays that I think are kind of secondary plays, not must plays as a result, but they do have some upside today. So let's go ahead and look at those, and we're going to start with the 2 guards, and I have Sir'Jabari Rice for Texas. Now, I've liked him quite a bit this season. I've used him some games. His price has popped up, unfortunately, which makes him harder to roster. But he has been pretty consistent, and he's actually got a pretty good floor despite the price. Though he doesn't project all that well today. But he is on a team that is projected to win in a tight game. So I do like him from that perspective. Like I said, I think he's a decent secondary play and someone to consider. And then we're going to look at Isaiah Wong for Miami, another guy from Miami I kind of like today. His price has also come up a little bit. He is not a must-play as a result of that. He is a good secondary play. I feel like he's kind of the type of guy that if you need a guy that's 80, in the mid 8,000 range to fit in a utility spot, then he's definitely a guy that can do that, fit that role. He has a pretty solid floor, but he's had a couple games that are pretty low in the due to the fact that he doesn't score a ton of points typically. He usually scores around 10 to 15 actual points a game, sometimes a little bit more. He's had a couple games where he's had blowups, but he tends to stick in that range, and so it's a little bit concerning if he only gets like 10 or 11 real points, if he'll be able to get to where we need to go from a fantasy perspective. But he does get some rebounds and assists, which help. But he's not somebody that's likely to get like a double-double. And typically when we're paying over 8,000 for a guy, we want him to do that. But for a guard, he does average 0.86 fantasy points per game, and that does give him some safety on a small slate like this. And then we're going to look at our two forwards that I like, and I'm going to start with Christian Bishop here for Texas. Now, he's probably the least happy guy that I have when it comes to the sub 5,000 players, just because he is a little bit higher in price, but he does have a pretty good fantasy point per minute. He's not super ideal, obviously, but he is one of the few guys at forward that I think is a good value play. He does have more sub 10 fantasy point games than I like, but he does play around 20 minutes a game, and as the season's progressed, he's been pretty good, though he doesn't ever really score more than 6 or 7 real points, but he gets enough rebounds usually to get in the 10 to 15 range. As you can see, he averages 15 fantasy points per game, and that's okay for the slate, but obviously we don't typically like that on a smaller slate like this. Or like on a normal slate, but on a smaller slate like this, he's somebody you can consider, especially when there's not a lot of value plays to have. And then finally, we're going to look at Jalen Bridges for Baylor. Now, he is $6,500, and he's pretty much, aside from Jabari Rice at guard, he's probably the only guy in the 6,000 range I really liked today. Though, again, he's kind of risky because he tends to have good fantasy points per minute, but he does tend to be a little bit shaky on the total minutes he plays. Even though he does get over 30 most games, he does always. And then sometimes he doesn't score a ton of points, but he does get decent amount of rebounds because he does play hard, and so I do think he does have some decent upside here. Not only that, but he's on a team that's projected to win, so that does give him some bonus as well, and his price is actually pretty decent for his potential in this matchup. Obviously not super ideal because he doesn't always get a ton of fantasy points, but he does have some decent upside, and so I think he's viable on the slate. With that said, that's what I have for college basketball. Not my favorite slate, with it only being 3 games, and there's really not anybody that just jumps off the page at me as a must-play, but there is some viability here and some guys you can mix and match in with maybe a couple other guys that you're going to take a chance on having big games. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.